For his neutral special, he wields a gun.
Like a Dragon Ishin is the latest game in the Yakuza franchise, and yeah, look, Sega is going to have to try a lot harder if they want me to stop calling it the Yakuza franchise. Just look man, it's gonna take a few more years and titles until there are sufficient games to call it the franchise formerly known as Yakuza. And Like a Dragon just doesn't roll off the tongue as well as Yakuza, which is a name that also works well in a lot of different languages. Everybody I know that called it Yakuza still calls it Yakuza, so it's going to be hard to move on even if I wanted to. On the other hand, Like a Dragon does shorten up to Lad, which is pretty funny, like, hey lads, do you want to play some Lad? If that sounds vaguely homo, then don't worry, that's on brand, since this entire game is vaguely homo. Welcome to the world of Ishin. In case you're new to Yakuza game, they are cutscene heavy, story-based games, and when I say cutscene heavy, I mean cutscene heavy. Multiple feature-length movies worth of cutscenes for each game, and this one is no exception. Ishin ditches the modern-day setting of most of the other games in the franchise to follow the story of real-life historical figure Sakamoto Ryoma, a samurai from the province of Tosa who is sent away by his adoptive father to the city of Edo, which will become Tokyo in the future in order to study the blade. The actual story begins with him coming back home after a year of training in Edo, and he barely gets to set his foot on his hometown, the much more humble Tosa, before he already gets into a fight with the Joshi samurai. You see, samurai in Tosa are divided into the Joshi, a nobility samurai sort of class, and the Goshi, which are lower class samurai. Sakamoto is a Goshi, but in order to save a life, he picks a fight with the Joshi and in Grand Yakuza tradition, gets sent to jail soon after the start of the game. However, this time he doesn't get to spend decades in there since he's quickly rescued by his adoptive father, Yoshida Toyo. You see, Toyo hates the class-based system of the Tosa province, and in order to change it, he helped set up the Tosa Loyalist Party with his other adoptive son, Takechi Hanpeita. Ryoma is quickly sent to talk with his brother about joining the party and get set up as the party representative. This ruffles some feathers inside the Loyalist party since he just came home after a year and nobody even knows him, so he kicks some ass to prove his point and goes to meet up with his family in a fancy castle in order to plan their next move that should, in theory, allow them to abolish the class system. Everything's seemingly going well until suddenly a ninja appears and murders his father. Ryoma tries his best to beat him, but ultimately he loses and has to jump off a cliff to escape, swearing that he one day will discover who killed his father. Anyway, that's the prologue of the game. The real plot starts now as Ryoma changes name to Saito Hajime, joins up with the Shinsengumi and unveils half a dozen conspiracies in order to understand who really killed his father and why. It's a plot with various twists and turns and lovable characters as well as hateable characters, in both cool scenes but also some frustrating moments, but the first thing I would like to point out is how slow it is. I usually try to only show early game footage to avoid spoilers as much as possible, so forgive me if I have to show some late game footage this time, because it takes 4 whole chapters before Ryoma even joins the Shinsengumi, and at that point there are still major gameplay elements that have yet to be introduced. The opening up of this open world is at a snail's pace. Which isn't to say that's necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of game in this game, so you don't have to worry about something unlocking too late and you missing the chance to use it. You just gotta have the patience to do half of the main story before you get access to all of the side content. What you do have to worry about though is the constant shader stuttering during cutscenes, especially when blood starts flying. The game just freaks the fuck out and stutters like hell during these cutscenes, which suck because 1, there is a lot of blood in this game, and 2, it usually punctuates dramatic moments, so it's really sad when a character you like dies only for the game to decide now it's the perfect time to ruin your immersion. That I had immersion at all though is definitely a big mark in this game's favor. The mystery, the intrigue, the infighting, trying to figure out just what the hell is going on. It's all pretty great and I just had a lot of fun. It's hard to explain why I had a lot of fun without telling spoilers, so just trust me, even when you think you had everything figured out, the game still throws some weird curveballs on your ways, and the villains are just so perfect. Every cutscene where they managed to escape without dying made me mad as hell, just waiting for the chance to slash them and finally end this shit, which it's a frustrating, but it's the kind of feeling you want the player to have towards a character you want them to kill. The kind of feeling you want to feel towards good antagonists. And there are of course some bro characters and bro moments that you hang out with, including an incredibly good moment that once again I can't spoil, but it's just fantastic. It ain't perfect though. My two main complaints are that by the time the final squad of heroes is assembled, half of them barely showed up in the game. It's super weird how important these characters are in the end compared to how much you actually dive into their backstories and personalities, especially since the ones you know, you really get to know. I really wish the game had more chapters, or more reasonably, since this game is already stuffed, made us spend some time with them in the downtime so we could explore them some more. My second complaint is that a lot of characters die in very contrived ways, or they survived in some very contrived ways and then show up in places and talk about a bunch of stuff. A lot of weird exposition, and then they leave when you are sure they should have died, only to die a few days later anyway in their next appearance. It is incredibly weird until you remember that, oh shit, this is a historical game, and these people are real people that lived in Japan, and it makes me wonder if all of that is because they did die in specific ways and certain events did happen, so the writers had no choice but to contrive these events into existence. And while that's understandable if that is the case, I still wish those events would blend a little more with the rest of the plot. You know, maybe I would have a bit more appreciation for them if I had more knowledge of Japanese history. If I could say, oh, this is how they're going to deal with that, but instead, those things are just weird. Also, since we are on the topic of history, I should put a disclaimer in here that I do not know much about the Shinsengumi. The last media I consumed with them was when I watched the first 200 episodes of Gintama a couple of years ago, and they were all haha funny men with swords, but it is, to my understanding, that in real life the Shinsengumi acted more like a secret police, killing dissidents during the daytime and performing surprise raids to kill even more dissidents during the night. So they were not exactly, you know, good people, so I was wondering how they would be portrayed in this game, and well, funny enough, they wrote them just like a Yakuza family in the mainline series. There are a few good ones, the boss has sort of good intentions, but they are mostly infighting scumbags and psychopaths, so yeah, make of that what you will. Ishin was originally released in Japan between Yakuza 5 and 0, so just like how Kenzan worked as a prototype of some ideas that would eventually make their way into Yakuza 3, Ishin's main combat gimmick is the style switching feature that would end up being one of Yakuza 0's main features. In this case, you only get one protagonist with 4 styles. Your basic style is Swordsman, which allows Ryoma to slash his enemies to ribbons using his sword. It allows you to do some sick parries, and it is the only style that allows you to block enemy attacks using your sword. It is a very defensive style, but also a powerful one, suited to one-on-one battles and boss fights. Not long after the sword is introduced, you get the Gunner style, which allows you to pull out a revolver and ask those filthy casuals if they can parry bullets. It leaves you vulnerable with no guard and it has low damage, but it is essential to hit slower enemies that hit hard when near you, as well as picking off faraway enemies. You can also deal heavier damage by using special bullets you can craft to do fun things like setting your enemies on fire. While it is a weaker style compared to Swordsman, if you manage to dodge the enemies, you can in fact end entire encounters without a single scratch through the power of gunpowder. And then there is the Gold, the best style, the one that allows you to both dual wield gun and sword. The Wild Dancer style. It is best suited to taking down groups of enemies, allowing you to do fast slashes as well as charge up a barrage of bullets to deal death to everything within a 15-meter radius, give or take 5 meters. It deals less damage than Swordsman, but it has the best dodge to compensate, along with endgame skills that make you deal more damage the higher your combo. It is the ultimate dodge beast, and it's just plain fun to dodge an attack before unleashing the pain, dodging at the last second and then pulling your gun and being like bang before the enemy even notices you're there. It has Bayo energy basically. Not big Bayo energy, but it has enough Bayo energy to really appeal to a Bayo fanatic like me. It is the dodge character. Do you like dodging? You like this style. Oh yeah, of course, I kind of forgot of something. There is the last style, Brawler, which is fucking useless. Okay, maybe I'm being too harsh, Brawler plays the same as other Yakuza games, no weapons, just your fists. But the problem is, even as you level it up, it is by far the weakest style. There is absolutely no reason to use it over other styles, since the damage you do simply does not scale as well as the damage of simply using a sword. So by the end of the game, its only use is to grab enemies when you're on a bridge and throw them off for an instant kill. But I don't know, maybe there's a secret way to use it, maybe it is a Magikarp skill and when you level it up all the way you become unstoppable. I mainly just leveled it up though because it has by far the largest amount of health upgrades and those are shared between all styles, so it's always good to have those. And speaking of leveling up, this game has a funky gimmick to its level up system. You do have a normal experience system and every time you level up you get a training orb you can use to upgrade on your upgrade tree, which is mostly linear with a few branching skills. However, as you use your styles, you get training orbs exclusive to those styles that can only be used on those trees. However, you can swap a neutral training orb for an exclusive training orb from that tree, meaning you essentially get an experience point back to invest elsewhere. Assuming you want to, of course. You could just ignore the opportunity of getting the point back and instead invest on another skill you don't have yet from the same tree. Essentially, speedrunning the skill tree if one or two styles are all you want to play with. There's also a large emphasis on crafting weapons and equipment. You're a samurai after all, and since samurai don't fight mainly using their fists, you have to invest time and money into crafting ever better equipment, or you might get left behind. The emphasis on equipment is also why the brawler style is so bad. You simply need to craft the golden katana of +5 ass kicking, because that's what's going to help you kill the next boss faster. And on top of all of that, there is another way for you to grow in the form of virtue. Virtue is gathered when you complete sub-stories, win battles, buy stuff, and basically do anything. They can be traded for abilities and inventory upgrades, and as such, this is a basic reward system that also made its way into Yakuza 0. And speaking of inventory, I really like the return to basics this game has. Newer games from Ryuga Gotoku Studio have toyed around with the idea of extremely limited inventories, but Yakuza is a JRP freaking G, baby, and I want to be able to thank a boss by carrying 30 homemade meals in my pockets if I want to. Thank you very much. Something a bit different from every other Yakuza game though is how heat works in this game. For those who are new to the series, heat is essentially your mana bar, which allows you to pull off sick moves of enemies if it is charged to a certain level. In other Yakuza games, you usually lose heat when attacked and hitting enemies that are guarding do not give you any heat, but in this game not only hitting those guarding enemies will generate heat, but you also do not lose any heat when you're hit, which is great because you will get hit. A lot. The other big combat gimmick in this game that did not get carried to Yakuza 0 though are trooper cards. These ugly ass things that you can see on the UI right now. You unlock them when you unlock what are essentially dungeons. You can basically run dungeon crawls with your Shinsegumi buddies, and you can also recruit new fighters into your troops as you battle random enemies in the game. Each ally gets added to your roster in the form of cards, and you can equip up to 3 cards to each style. All of the cards boost your stats in a passive way, but they each also got an active skill that you can charge to be able to use. In the original release, you could only use those cards during dungeon crawls, but now they are part of the main game and you can use them anywhere. You can of course ignore them if you want to get a more purist experience, but I do not recommend that unless you want to turn your playthrough into a challenge run, because you see, the entire game has been redesigned around the cards, around you having those cards and their skills available at all times. Even bosses have been redesigned to have extra special attacks based around the skill cards. The game has been, for lack of a better word, cardified, and now you have to deal with it, which is not so bad. Thankfully they didn't turn this game into a deck-based roguelite, and because of the small amount of cards you have to set, you don't have to spend too much time thinking about strategy. Just set up the highest rarity cards will do the job. That also allows you to level them up without having to think about breaking the ceiling, because yes, in this game you have to level the cards up, and the rarity decides the maximum level, and you get to pull them randomly, and oh god, they did it. They did gacha in Yakuza. Actually, it's more like gacha in Yakuza has evolved from silly toys to actual character gacha. We will all pay for this sinful behavior one day. I don't understand what the thought process was behind making the cards a permanent fixture. I think maybe it was an attempt to like a dragon fight the game a little bit, make it a little bit sillier, since silly it's kind of Yakuza's brand in the West now, and Yakuza Like a Dragon had all of these silly summons all over the place, so now we have samurai superpowers, because you see, while there is some silliness and over-the-topness to the combat, this is actually a pretty serious entry into the franchise. The blood and death and political backstabbing has been turning to overdrive, and since you only play as Ryoma, according to the protag never kills rule, this means everybody else is free to slaughter people by the dozen. Also, that rule is bullshit, since even Ryoma has a body count to his name come the end of story mode, so you know, maybe they thought people would think that this title was a little bit too dark, you know? Maybe you need to put some Dragon Quest skills here somehow. Not that there is nothing silly at all about this game. All of the side content, it's mostly very silly. The infamous side quests known as sub-stories continue their path of delivering some of the most absurd non-sequiturs ever written. One of my personal favorite ones being about the cat that supposedly brings luck if you give him all of your life savings, or the one where you have to figure out from a group of suspects who ate a guard's neck based on who is lying and who is telling the truth. Sub-stories do a great job of fleshing out this little slice of historical Kyoto and the wacky people that inhabit it, even if it is not technically historically accurate. Historical accuracy is also thrown out of the window for the minigames. Like every Yakuza title, this game is loaded with minigames, including karaoke, which was definitely not around for Restoration period Japan. In this case, rendered as a singing bar, which has the best rendition of Baka Mitai in the entire franchise. Fight me if you disagree. But every Yakuza game has one big minigame that is the meatiest one, to the point it's barely mini anymore. And this one is no exception. The main big distraction from the main plot in Ishin is called Another Life, and it's basically a streamlined farming simulator featuring this game's rendition of Haruka. Unlike in a lot of other titles, Haruka is not a character in the main story of Ishin. Instead, she is an orphan Ryoma randomly finds one day in debt soon after her parents' death. With the help of a priest, he essentially becomes her adoptive dad, or sorry, adoptive uncle I guess, and decides to take the house she would have to sell to survive and fix up the little patch of land in front of it so he can grow vegetables and sell them in order to repay the debt. The game implies you need to repay the debt at regular intervals, but actually you really don't. You will eventually get a ladder asking for payment, but you can just take your time, planting vegetables on a grid and reaping the rewards when they are ripe for harvest. You don't need, however, limited items like seeds to plant vegetables. You can always plant every vegetable you already unlocked. How do you unlock them? By paying with virtue in a nearby shrine. You can also use virtue to upgrade the size of your field and shorten the time it takes to harvest the vegetables. Because really the only currency you have to deal with in this field is time. It takes time for them to get ready to be plucked out of the ground, and the more valuable the vegetable, the more time it takes. But otherwise, once unlocked, you can just harvest to infinity without the need for further currency. Then you can do one of two things. You can check a cabinet inside the house filled with the orders of your neighbors, and if you have the necessary vegetables or fish or whatever item they're asking for, you can fulfill the order in exchange for money and other rewards, usually fertilizer that allows you to speed up your harvests. If you don't want to sell them, you can instead cook with them in, you guessed it, a cooking minigame. You can then also sell the food that you made, or you can keep it and use it as healing items. Some of the best healing items in the game can only be made by cooking, so it's time to bust out the cookbook and prove your worth in the kitchen. And if you need extra ingredients, then there's also fishing. You can do some river fishing or some sea fishing, but each one works exactly the same, with the only difference being the fish you can find in each area. It's a pretty simple system. You see the fish swimming and you cast in the hopes of hooking it, but just like farming, there are no bait items in the game. Well, there are, but all they do is attract fish and essentially reset the region if you fish too much. If you don't want that, you can just fish endlessly with fishing rods you can buy, you guessed it once again, with virtue. You can pretty quickly get the best rod and then just fish however you want, whenever you want. This lack of dependency on money or items make these time wasters incredibly attractive. It just makes you want to hop onto them in between story objectives because, after all, they cost nothing. What does cost something, however, is gambling. which is backing numerous farms. You can play Koi Koi using Hanafuda cards, which I thankfully understand somewhat thanks to Clubhouse Games on the Switch. Thank you, Clubhouse Games. And you can play Chohan, the dice game where you bet on evens or odds. And of course, Mahjong returns and basically all of that good board game stuff is back. The most glamorous side activity is, well, it's a classy dance school, but in the shadier side of things, the biggest one, for me, is definitely cock races. You heard me right. Cock races. Where Nugget's ancestors duke it out and you bet on which one is going to come out first. Or you can also bet on the exact order of which one. It's basically horse racing, but with cock. I love this game. The thing tying it all together though is definitely the world itself. You see, I love samurai, so I tried playing all sorts of samurai games from Sekiro until now. I played Ghost of Tsushima, I played Nioh, but they were all very aggressive focused, very sad or mad experiences, if you will. They had beauty but also a lot of brutality. But Like a Dragon Ishin finally delivers what I wanted from the very beginning many years ago, and that is coziness. The world of Ishin can be seedy and dangerous, and there is a slum with an old burnt building that complements the landscape, reminding you no matter where you go that even among all the supposed prosperity of Japan's old capital, people still suffer under the current regime like they always did. But life goes on, people must eat and live and have fun while they can, so the streets are always filled with people, and there's a very sort of pulse of the society vibe going around every Yakuza game, and this is no exception. The city is great, it's filled with nooks and crannies to explore, and going to shops or stopping at bars with fully detailed interiors does wonders to really drag you into the setting. Just slowly walking around, taking the details, is way more fun than you would think. This game world is smaller than most open world games out there, but the level of detail in each corner makes it feel more alive, more fleshed out than most open world games out there. So yeah, it's a trade-off, and I think I prefer this side of the deal. The entire game is honestly super cozy. The moment the main plot actually begins, it starts with Ryoma waking up in an inn in a very cozy room and looking outside only to see right outside his window this beautiful tree with autumn leaves. And then he can go outside and walk around every corner of the place, which has a layout that is pretty much what you would expect of an inn, yet gives this indescribable feeling of being home, of coziness. Or maybe it's not undescribable, I just suck at describing it, but it's certainly very good, and I approve of it. Walking around the city at night gives completely different vibes with the warm lights of the lanterns lighting up the city streets, though they are just as lively as they are during the day, befitting what might have been one of the biggest bustling cities in Restoration period Japan. Let's just walk in silence for a bit so we can take it all in. And of course, there are different neighborhoods with different looks. This one, for example, weirded me out when I first stepped into it because of how empty it is. I thought the game wasn't loading any NPCs out of some error, but turns out that was on purpose. This is after all a back alley kind of place. It is too wide to be an alley, but most of the other buildings around the city sort of face backwards from it, so it becomes this sort of hidden in plain sight place that looks more like the Wild West than the lively city centers that exist around it. But it does, however, give it a unique character that makes it so it sticks out in your mind. Knowing where the good places are, the bad places, the empty ones, and the lively ones, and building this mental map in your head really makes you feel like you know this place, like you lived in this city. It is, once again, time to bring up a beloved term for this franchise, virtual tourism. A term that applies here more than you'd think, since this is a historical game from a historical period which, by definition, we do not live in anymore. But it's still closer than you'd think, because in real life, Kyoto is quite possibly the most well-conserved city in Japan. It has plenty of well-kept historical buildings, meaning you could probably book a trip to Japan right now and see some of the buildings featured in this very game. Assuming, of course, you have time, and money, and the will to leave your room. But venturing outside is for the brave. I'm content in my gamer dungeon playing simulacrum of outside reality, and in those terms, there's little out there that's better than Ishin. I would actually place it right next to Zero as the two best Yakuza games because, well, it kind of makes sense really. Ishin has a lot of stuff that would be carried on to Zero after all, and both Ishin and Zero can be played with no knowledge of the rest of the franchise as your first entry if you want to. In fact, playing Ishin as your first game might be the best way to experience it, since you won't get too distracted from the fact that all of the characters are returning face cams from other games. Basically feeling like the Yakuza cast decided to star in a samurai movie. So, whether you want some comfy historical feelings, or if you want a hack and slash with the feel of a heavy brawler, I recommend Like a Dragon Ishin to everyone interested in the franchise, both fans and newcomers. And once again, thank you very much for watching to the very end. I'll see you at the Talk Races.
バカみたい子供なのね夢を追って傷ついて嘘が下手なくせに笑えない笑顔を見せた I love you ろくに言わない口下手でほんまに不器用なのにどうしてさよならは言えたのダメだねダメよダメなのよあんたが好きで好きすぎてどれだけ強いお酒で